My name is Dan Rundy. I'm a Senior Vice President and I hold the Schreier Chair in Global Analysis here at CSIS. I'm also the Director of the Project on Prosperity and Development. At the beginning of this global pandemic, which has claimed nearly 1 million lives and disrupted that of several more millions, the global economy went into a massive shock. China, the virus's source, imposed strict lockdown measures to contain the outbreak in March, sending strong shockwaves across global supply chains. The global economy has been over-reliant on Chinese manufacturing production for a long time. In 2018, China contributed 13.5% in global exports and was responsible for 28% of global manufacturing output, a jump from 8% in 2004. Unsurprisingly, the world's second largest economy was also the top exporter and manufacturer of goods worldwide and the leading global trading partner, making any disruption to its manufacturing hubs tremendously consequential to global supply chains. As production faltered at the start of 2020, China's global exports fell by 17% between January and February, while shipping capacity from major Chinese ports decreased from 20 to 50%. Industries worldwide face an estimated economic impact of $2 trillion, with many particularly at risk due to their extremely complex, globally integrated supply chains. The current vulnerabilities have emerged despite decades of globalization that have produced complex supply chains where manufacturing processes are scattered among firms operating in different countries. Global supply chains are primarily driven by economic efficiency, reductions in tariff and non-tariff barriers, enhance in international trade, and declines in transportation costs make it easier for companies to ship and source from abroad. There's an international consensus that severe vulnerabilities exist in global supply chains and that the new ways of tackling these shortcomings are needed. Our sincere thanks to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Japan and our friends at the Embassy of Japan in Washington, D.C. Their generous support has allowed CSIS to research this topic and release a new white paper that shares our policy recommendations on how the global supply chain system can be de-risked and diversified, making the global economy more resilient to future supply shocks. I'm very grateful to Bill Reinsch, a friend, a trade expert, and the Scholl Chair in International Business at CSIS. Bill has been an endless source of wisdom as he helped guide us on this project. To discuss this conversation further, we are joined today by an excellent group of speakers who've had a long and distinguished record in public service or have worked at the intersection of the public sector and the private sector. We have from the U.S. Department of Commerce, we have Assistant Secretary for Industry and Analysis, Nazak Nikakhtar. We have the Chief Representative for Strategic Research for Japan's Bank for International Cooperation, known as JBIC, Mr. Shin Oya. And we have Mr. John Murphy, who is the Senior Vice President for International Policy at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. Thank you all for being here. Let me start with you, Assistant Secretary Nikakhtar. Thanks for being with us. I know that the U.S. government is thinking a lot about and working hard on these issues of de-risking supply chains. The world's a different place, and I know the Commerce Department is working hard on this.
Yeah, so we are leading the interagency effort to look at supply chains and supply chain vulnerabilities. Look, we all understand the reasons for and the merits to diversifying global supply chains. A dependency on key materials from one nation, of course, makes businesses so incredibly vulnerable to the wide range of disruptions that can erupt at any time globally. But for a long, long time, economists used to scoff at the calls for countries to pursue policies that were aimed at national security production capacity. They argued that in a globalized world, a nation could always turn to other countries if something happened to their own supply chains. But very interestingly, even Adam Smith, the father of free trade, noted that it was undesirable for a country to become dependent on its neighbors for military equipment in the event that it was unable to protect itself due to reliance on foreign supplies. In the words of Adam Smith, and I want to quote this, quote, "It is of importance that the kingdom depend as little as possible upon its neighbors for the manufacturers necessary for defense," end quote. We in the US government and actually globally, we ignored this principle for a long time. But now we finally have come to learn from the coronavirus pandemic that borders do matter, because any sovereign state has the right and ability to restrict exports to the rest of the world at any time, just as countries did a few months ago. And so this is a powerful reminder for us that self-reliance is essential and needs to be regained because, and I want to underscore this, the basic political and economic unit will always remain the nation state. But as you know, while the world is struggling to manage the pandemic, China is aggressively pushing forward with strategic campaigns to dominate major sectors of global trade. It is spending an unprecedented amount, for example, in foreign direct investments abroad to get a hold of key strategic sectors. So, you know, folks often ask, well, what can be done? You've produced a brilliant paper on this issue. Earlier this year, I was asked by the White House to lead the interagency effort on assessing supply chain vulnerabilities and reshoring, in part because of my office's unit, where we study industry competitiveness, but also being a trade lawyer and an economist, having had decades of experience in this field, we launched this initiative. As part of this work, we identified over 700 products that are key to U.S. national security, that are critical, whether it's in a time of war, a pandemic, cyber attack, other type of national emergency. And those 700 products relates to semi-finished goods, raw materials, and finished goods. We are analyzing each product and sector to determine if the supply chains are weak, or if our industry has eroded, or whether the growth of an industry in the United States has been materially retarded by predatory imports. And if either of these things are happening, we're analyzing why. Why is important? Why is all of this important? We need to evaluate causation. If there are external or internal factors that have weakened our industry. If we can identify the problem, then we can employ policy tools to solve the problem. We need to do this on a permanent basis, this type of rigorous analysis, regardless of what the administration. I also want to talk about, with the 700 list of products, now the second component is how do we incentivize inward investments in domestic manufacturing and R&D activities. We've begun doing this through tax cuts to boost innovation and economic growth. We need to do more. Third, the U.S. government procurement authority, like the Defense Production Act, so critical. It's important to provide capital to new American investments and to generate immediate demand for those new production operations. This will compel companies to take a leap of faith and reinvest in the United States. And of course, it's axiomatic that for U.S. investments to grow, we need to have a strategy to fight back against predatory import competition. Low-cost imports that are predatory in nature, that are aiming to undercut U.S. and production and growth, need to be halted at the border. These are and finally, the final element is to work with allies to develop resilient supply chains. We can talk a little bit about that later, about the merits of reshoring and some of the, or nearshoring, I should say, and some of the inherent risks there. But I really wanted to start by laying these elements out because these are key to a comprehensive reshoring strategy. They need to be done in collaboration with U.S. government agencies. And most fundamentally, what are the incentives, again, to bring businesses back here? But what do we need to do to protect those investments from predatory import competition that has led to the erosion of key industries to begin with?
Thanks, Assistant Secretary. That's great. It's very encouraging. I'll look forward to coming back to you. I've got several questions. Thanks very much. Mr. Oya, thanks very much for being with us. Tell us about, how does JBIC see that? I know Japan is thinking about this and is taking a number of steps, and welcome your thoughts.
Thank you, Dan, for inviting me here. This is a very important topic. And as JBIC, I think we are doing three things. One is a kind of policy dialogue. We are discussing with developing countries, government, how to improve investment climate. Because even though Japanese companies think about relocate production facility to from China, investing countries' investment climate is very important. Therefore, policy dialogue for improving investment climate in recipient countries is very important. This is number one. Number two, we JBIC finance infrastructure. It's railways, a port or airport or the power or industrial park. So this is itself very important, but this also improve investment climate. This is number two. And number three, we are directly financing the Japanese companies' relocation cost. So if Japanese company is, too much focusing on single country, and if they think it's a better idea to relocate, of course it costs money. So we are financing such kind of things. So this is basically what we JBIC is doing, kind of things. And more generally, we totally agree that Assistant Secretary, too much dependence on single country, this is very dangerous. And companies themselves think about such danger. So companies themselves consider that trade-off between efficiency and also resilience. So nowadays, they think resilience is more important, so they started to think about. However, if there is element of that national security, private sector's, decision might be a little bit different from that national viewpoint, because there is a possibility that they do not factor in sufficiently enough this national security element. Therefore, it might be legitimate that some government intervention can be subsidy or can be the policy finance kind of things. However, we also need to strike right balance. If we try to reshore everything to home country, that will weaken the country itself. So we need to strike right balance. That's my feeling. Anyway, thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Shin. John Murphy, thanks for being with us. You've been at the Chamber of Commerce for 20 years. Your members are experienced and, are the ones that help set up global supply chains. We all benefit from that. I like getting avocados all 12 months a year. I like being able to order stuff and have stuff show up at my doorstep on Amazon. And so we're all beneficiaries implicitly of globalization. At the same time, this has been a major disruptor in globalization, and I think we've all had to kind of go back to the drawing board and rethink this. How are your members thinking about these issues? How are your members thinking about supply chain resiliency?
Well, Dan, thank you very much for the chance to be here. And like the others, I appreciate the thoughtful paper that you all put out talking about some of these issues. And it's great to be here with the Assistant Secretary and with Shin to talk about these issues. I think the business community is thinking hard about these issues, and I think if I could make a very broad, perhaps not terribly helpful comment about the conclusion is that as they think about the vulnerabilities and the supply chains of American industry, it all comes down to a simple conclusion that, well, it depends. It depends on the product you're talking about. And we're hearing wildly divergent things across industries. So if you're talking about avocados or flip-flops or, wire harnesses that go in cars, you have different solutions. As the Assistant Secretary points out, when there's a national security nexus, that's different. And there's nothing new here about the U.S. export control regime or the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States or other measures taken by the Defense Department. It is indispensable that when it comes to national security, that we have laws and regulations that ensure that we're not reliant for key products on foreign sources, and especially from foreign sources that may not be allies. But when you talk about all these other products, you get very divergent views and strategies from different industries. And I think a couple of points I hear from companies is, first of all, job one, when it comes to health goods, for instance, is we're in a pandemic and job one is to fight the pandemic. And we shouldn't be taking measures now that will make that more difficult. Another point that I hear often is that we need to understand before we regulate more. And that's why I think it's useful that Congress in the CARES Act passed legislation that has called for a comprehensive study by the national academies to look at U.S. supply chains and U.S. supply chain vulnerabilities. Now, we have some efforts like that that are undertaken regularly by the Defense Department or the FDA, which looks at drugs that are sourced from a single foreign source. But we do need to look more regularly at this. Beyond that, and I'm happy to get into this as we go along with the conversation, but what I see from companies is the view that we need different solutions for different products. And that's a big topic, and I look forward to delving into that with you as we go along.
Thanks, John. That's great. Let me stick with you, and then maybe I'll bring our colleagues into the conversation. But Shin, if you just put yours back on mute for a second, and I'll bring you back in a second. But John, if you think about your members, talk about. I certainly think there's absolutely a place for onshoring back to the United States, but there's going to be some products and services where it may be difficult to do that. Could you talk a little bit more about that?
Sure. So we need to be strategic about what's really valuable here. So, I mentioned wire harnesses. Wire harnesses are these, this mess of wires that goes into a new car. They haven't been made in the United States in years. They're typically made in countries such as Honduras. It's low wage, low value added product. We don't need to be reshoring those kinds of products. We need to identify areas where there's a sensitivity, for instance. But we need to be realistic about it as well. So think about generics, for instance. Generic medicines, a lot of these products are imported, and there is concern about antibiotics, for instance, that maybe too much of the API comes from China, for instance, or India. But what are the solutions that are going to fix that? Now, the industry group, the Association for Accessible Medicines, which represents the generics industry, they put out a blueprint, which is very interesting on this. And, what they've said is, a little tax break isn't going to do it. It's not going to lead companies to undertake the 5, 6, 7, 8 year project of building a new generic pharmaceutical manufacturing facility in the United States, which costs billions of dollars. What's required for them, in their view, is long-term guaranteed price contracts. So I think that members of Congress who've been looking at this, they hear this kind of thing, and it kind of sets them back a little bit, and they say, okay, we need a deliberate approach to these questions about, what are the real priorities. We shouldn't be passing legislation that is just sort of feel-good legislation that says, a little tax break here or there, and think that it's going to alter that calculus. And then I think in some areas we need to recognize that our vulnerabilities are less than widely appreciated. So for innovative pharmaceuticals, 70% of what Americans consume is made in the United States, and most of the other 30% comes from countries such as Ireland, Switzerland, Germany. And that's for many products that I'm not sure that that's a priority, and that diversity is good. Dan, in your paper, you pointed out that one specific area where we did see real shortages in the spring when the pandemic and the lockdowns were at their height was in meat production. Well, those shortages were intense. They were real. They had an impact on the American economy. But that's an area where we had overwhelmingly domestic supply chains. So simply saying we're going to make everything here in the United States doesn't necessarily enhance the resilience of your supply chain. Now, that's different for national security goods, and I don't want to forget that point. But we need to go through this product by product, I think.
Assistant Secretary, I really appreciate your quote from Adam Smith, because I was very upset when there were sort of implied threats from the Chinese Communist Party earlier in the spring about, well, maybe we'll cut off your meds, or maybe we'll cut off your ventilators. I think that was in essence what the message was. That got my attention. That's what spurred us to do this work. So talk a little bit about, John has talked about nearshoring and onshoring. Certainly, you're making every effort at the Commerce Department on nearshoring. Could you talk about sort of making this distinction, nearshoring and onshoring? You made some remarks about it, but I'd love to hear a little bit more about that.
Yeah. So everything I kind of come at, I come at from the economist and sort of trade lawyer perspective. So with respect to sort of the national security, and we're talking about really critically the national security supply chain, I think that the goal is to really try to reshore as much as possible. Understanding, of course, as John mentioned, that it's probably impractical or impossible to really reshore everything you need. I think then there's two other approaches, right? What do you not reshore, but where can you actually retool to produce the things you need? And so when the pandemic happened, and we realized that we didn't have adequate PPEs in the United States. My office worked closely with the White House and with FEMA, and we were really looking at what are the production lines and production operations that can retool to produce what we need in an expeditious manner? What kind of funding is required to get them to retool? And really, how good are that products, and how can we get regulatory approval? We're now going to look back, and my hope is in partnership with FEMA to go and look at studies where companies have actually retooled, and again, what the lead time has been, what the costs have been, and how quickly we can get up and running. So one is reshore. Two, if you can't reshore, let's look at retooling operations. I really do think the US government needs to have sort of a repository of index of companies that can actually shift production operations to retool. And again, what the lead time is and what the cost is, so we can plan better in the future. And then finally, nearshoring. I like the concept of nearshoring because, like we all know, we take advantage of the cost structures of our friends and allies. But the critical component that I find missing from these discussions is if we put critical supply chains in a neighboring country, for example, Canada or Mexico, let's make sure, or somewhere south of the border, let's make sure that those countries have adequate investment screening mechanisms. If I'm going to be reliant, if widgets are critical to national security, a critical component, and I'm relying in part, maybe some domestic production, maybe some reliance on Mexico, maybe entire reliance on Mexico. I need Mexico to have a good investment screening review mechanism. So when there's predatory FDI in Mexico, the supply chain that I'm reliant on will remain. Those countries, we need to also make sure that they have adequate trade remedy tools, right? I've seen for over 2 decades, our industry is being decimated by predatory imports, whether dumped, subsidized goods. So let's make sure that we'll work with our allies to make sure that they are able to leverage adequately and aggressively their legal trade remedy tools to defend those industries from, again, predatory import competition. And let's just make sure that we work closely with allies, that they're stand ready to be prepared to fight back using other laws and mechanisms like we had with the 232 actions against maybe a global overcapacity that is threatening critical industries. I should also mention, one thing that's not really discussed in overcapacity, we talk about steel and aluminum. Chemicals and optical fiber cables, the infrastructure for 5G, China's running a massive overcapacity in preform, which is the key input to basically massively depress global prices and wipe out competitors from the market. So let's make sure that if we're reliant on allies, our allies can invoke other legal measures to protect those industries from eroding that we're going to be reliant on. Thank you.
Thanks, Assistant Secretary. What I'm taking away is we're going to need a CFIUS for Mexico, a CFIUS for Central America, and that our friends are going to need, or CFIUS for Malaysia, or a CFIUS for Vietnam, excuse me. And we're going to need trade remedy tools, that they're going to need trade remedy tools. That speaks to me. I think about American foreign aid. We have a whole practice called trade capacity building and trade facilitation that primarily AID does. TDA does a little bit of it. MCC does a little bit of it. But it strikes me, if that's where we're going to have to go with nearshoring, we're probably going to have to apply certain kinds of foreign assistance and make the case to the Congress that if we want to have and enable nearshoring, that we're going to have to spend some additional foreign assistance dollars to help countries get to that level.
I think you're right. Foreign assistance, I think better training and working with allies. And really, before we are reliant with allies or want to deepen our reliance, look at what our allies are currently doing in terms of protecting their critical industries. And do they stand ready to actually partner with us and be aggressive? And if they don't, then we've got to really rethink where we want our critical supply chains to reshore.
Right. Yeah. Okay. So Shin, could you talk about how is Japan thinking about this issue of onshoring versus nearshoring? Certainly, there's probably some, of course, a preference in Japan to nearshore, but at the same time, sorry, onshore. But at the same time, there's many situations or many supply chains where in Japan, the Japanese industry is looking to, instead of produce in mainland China, say produce in Southeast Asia, for example. Could you talk a little bit about that and how Japan's thinking about this conversation we've been having?
Yes, I think first, I agree that over-reliance on a single country, China, this is dangerous. So we have to think about a lot of things. And onshore or reshoring is one way, one mean to achieve this. But we also have other means too. For example, that stockpiling, increasing stockpiling, or expanding surge capacity, or can be that diversification. This is mainly we're discussing right now. And also international agreement to restrict export ban at the time of emergency. This is also important because especially that in case of PPE, demand itself expanded 5 times. So even though basically we have the manufacturing factory domestically, shortage might happen. So there are various means, and reshoring is only one possible means. I think this is number one. And number two, we have to be careful about that autarky syndrome, or mercantilist motivation. And from the viewpoint of national security, I think reshoring is one way. And this is exactly what the Assistant Secretary mentioned. I agree with that. But if we focusing, for example, increasing domestic employment, so let's reshore every factory from China or from Vietnam or from Thailand. This is not a good policy from the viewpoint of strengthening the national economy. So I think national economic strength is very important from the viewpoint of national security. Therefore, we need to think about how we can strengthen our economy. For doing that, we need to introduce the various means. Third thing with this is exactly what John mentioned. Selectivity is important. It depends on the product. So some product, this is very critical. So maybe we need reshoring or more diversification. But some products, we don't have to be so much sensitive. We don't have to be so careful. In that case, it's not so meaningful for us to forcing company to reshore to domestically. And final thing I want to mention is, cooperation among, liberal democratic country. This is very important. And for doing that, as Assistant Secretary mentioned, that cooperation on, for example, investment screening, this is also important, especially when we discuss about the technology sensitive area. CSIS type of mechanism is necessary, not only US, Japan, but also other countries where we are pushing companies to relocate. And cooperation among like-minded countries is important. For doing that, of course, we need to use existing mechanism, but we might necessary to think about new mechanism if necessary. That's my feeling. And also, I talked by myself. My view does not necessarily represent Japanese government, but that's what I'm thinking about.
Assistant Secretary, maybe this is a question for you as well as for the others, but how work across our allies? And we have the Indo-Pacific strategy, and certainly you've made clear, and I agree that if we're going to nearshore, we expect our partners to meet certain sorts of things. But are there some ways in which we can work with our allies? I'm sure you're having conversations with our allies and partners all the time. How do you think about how we can collectively work together along the lines of what Shin was referring to? And maybe then, sure, Shin, you might also come into this, and John as well. But Assistant Secretary, what do you think?
Yeah, so a couple of things. It's remarkable that our allies are really thinking about these situations the same way. I mean, Shin just sort of talked about the Japanese government and how they've been thinking about this. So I'm really encouraged that our allies are understanding the merits of reshoring and nearshoring. We are actually in the process of having good technical exchanges with allies. Bringing delegations of the US government and our allies together, talking about, listen, these are the ways, these are the analysis that the US government has done for our own economy, and we've actually done it for our allies too. These are the supply chain vulnerabilities, and this is how the United States is going about fixing and developing solutions to our supply chain vulnerabilities. There's two reasons why we're doing this. One is to the extent that we've thought about solutions that maybe our allies haven't, we are able to share some of our perspectives. And then the flip side is if our allies are looking at maybe ways that they are coordinating their solutions, we're apprised of that. So we know where they're going to be resilient to foster sort of greater ties and greater relationships and reliances there. So we are doing that. And I'm very, very encouraged that our allies are being quite forward leaning in this respect. Virtually, every ally and partner is now understanding the real dangers of being so dependent on China in particular, when China, Dan, as you said earlier, has been threatening to withhold critical items that we need, whether it's PPEs or whether it's rare earths, for example. So the world is kind of coalescing around this important national security imperative. My concern is as follows, that we get this right. We don't somehow get out of the pandemic and we lose sight of what we were trying to do. But my other concern is that we do this expeditiously, because the more time that elapses, I think the more vulnerable we can ultimately be. And in rare earths is a perfect example. Unless we figure out this rare earth thing very quickly, and I should say that we're working on really good solutions with the White House right now. But unless we implement semiconductors rare earth strategy very quickly, we might find ourselves in a position that we're so vulnerable that it'll be very hard to sort of dig ourselves out of that vulnerability.
Great. So Shin and John, could you talk about how should we be working together as liberal democracies? Shin, let me start with you, and then John. Shin?
Yeah, yes. I think, of course, as Assistant Secretary mentioned, already discussion has been started. So continuing this discussion and deepening this discussion is very important, I think. And of course, we have G7. Well, we also have Quad. Quad is mainly focusing national security, but maybe it's one way to expanding this function to the economic sphere. Or maybe we can think about that new membership and the new kind of organization, but this is informal. And this new that the liberal democratic like-minded team discuss about, for example, technology policy or supply chain issue. So anyway, as Assistant Secretary mentioned, that cooperation, coordination among like-minded countries is very important, because it's very impossible and it's very inefficient if only one country tries to sort out this issue. That's my strong feeling.
John?
So Dan, I think your paper made good points about how we should be working with other countries. That, for many products, diversification is an entirely appropriate approach, not being dependent on any single geographic locale for production of goods, but also how can we enhance capacity in some countries where we might want to see more nearshoring ongoing. For instance, the DFC is spending a lot of time in Colombia right now, which is trying to set itself up as a trusted partner of the United States and a place where we'd like to see supply chains develop rather than some other countries of the world. You also mentioned trade facilitation and trade finance. I think that kind of positive agenda is useful, because I do want to just sound a note of caution here. This conversation we're having about onshoring, nearshoring, we're not the only country having it, as has been noted. I was struck this morning reading the daily newsletter that comes out from Bloomberg called Supply Lines. Is really a summary of what's going on in Europe on these things. And it sounds a lot like the US conversation. The Europeans are looking at, maybe we want to be making all of our medical products here at home. Maybe we want to be making all of our semiconductors here at home. And it's not really a conversation about working with allies. It's about a movement towards a more isolated approach, potentially more protectionist. And the United States has a lot to lose in that. And I think it's imperative that we keep, when we're talking about national security sensitive products, that's one thing. And we have laws and regulations that we should use to address that. But when you're talking about other products, the United States has a lot to lose. So take the medical supply, medical products area. The United States is home to the world's best medical device industry. And it employs hundreds of thousands of Americans directly and indirectly. About half of its production is for export. Europe is by far the largest market for that. Some of the conversation over the past year about Buy American in that particular sector is potentially very dangerous, because if we went down that road in a heavy-handed way, the Europeans would certainly do the same. And so U.S. industry stands to lose a lot there. So it's really imperative that we work with our allies and that we not go too far, because closing off trade is really the last thing that our economic recovery needs right now.
Thing I just wanted to add, I know
Please.
that I know that the media, and this isn't John, but I know that the media really tries to depict what we're trying to do right now as being protectionist. And I just really want to clarify for at least the audience that that's just really not the case. Take the 232 measures. The way that China is operating is really attacking our vulnerabilities where there's no international rules or very weak international rules and disciplines to guard our industry. So take overcapacity. There's no sort of international norms on overcapacity. The Global Steel Forum, it didn't work. China decided that it wasn't going to comply with the recommendations. And so all we had left to protect critical industries were the 232 tariffs, right? And so I want people to understand that when we are under sort of assault and attack, we have to look at the tools we have in our tool chest and kind of be creative where there are no international rules and or the international rules are weak. I mean, we did the 301 tariffs because of the IP theft, and the WTO has conceded that China is not complying with its IP commitments. We had a 2015 bilateral agreement with China that they would refrain from stealing IP, and they, of course, haven't adhered to that. So I just want everybody to understand that this isn't about starting a trade war. This isn't about any of that. This is about countering strategies, very targeted, deliberate strategies that are aimed at hollowing out our most critical industries and really looking at the lack of international tools to deal with it, and then looking at our own toolbox to see, okay, well, what do I have to protect industries, to make sure that American industries can continue and American technological leadership can lead the way for the United States and for the rest of the world. Over.
All right, so let me ask each of you the final question. How do we prevent this ever happening again, where we're going to have some other, unfortunately, the world is such that we're going to have some other funny named disease that's going to disrupt this COVID-19 may look like a Sunday picnic compared to whatever the next one of these things are, whatever the horrible named disease shows up. We're going to have global pandemics. This is going to be a part of life, of modern life for forever, for a whole series of reasons I'm not going to get on into here, but in essence, because of zoological transfer of diseases, urbanization, use of airplanes. I don't think we can stop, connecting with the world because of fear of pandemic. We need to manage it. But one of the things we got to manage is make sure that no one can ever threaten us again, say, I'm going to cut off your medicine or cut off your ventilators, because I think that's what's generated this, useful discussion. So let me ask each of you, how do we stop this from ever happening again? So John, let me start with you, Shin, and then the Assistant Secretary. John?
Well, I think that's a good point. How do we plan for what comes next? I guess I'll just. I think it's worthwhile to think about specific products again. Take PPE. We've all lived through this terrible experience of the pandemic and dreadful shortages of personal protective equipment. But what went wrong here? I would contend is not really a question of offshoring. I've been in touch with some of the largest manufacturers of these goods, and they will tell you loudly and clearly, we never moved our production for the US market offshore. We always made our N95s for the United States and for all of North America here in the United States. So what went wrong? Why were there shortages? There were shortages because demand for PPE rose 50-fold in the pandemic, which is not a surprise. Every pandemic preparedness plan going back decades said that would happen. And that's why we needed to have a stockpile to address that when it comes to PPE. And we did have a stockpile. And this is a problem that goes back many years, well before the Trump administration. It was never adequately funded. We never had the investment, the dollars needed, because Congress after Congress, found it expensive to maintain that stockpile at an adequate level. So it's easy to say there was a shortage and therefore we need to onshore. Onshoring would not have solved that problem in that case. And so there's, and if you look at the medicine supply, the number of medicines that we've had shortages of during the pandemic is actually a very small and limited range. And there are specific ones and we should do something about it. But again, we don't need a broad brush solution that could potentially make the situation worse.
Shin.
Yes, I think we do not think we can completely eliminate the possibility this will happen again. I think same things will happen again. And this time it was COVID-19, but next time maybe a little bit different kind of the shock. And the same policy cannot be utilized. I mean, N95 mask was very important this time, but next time different product can be required, and we might face shortage of such kind of product. This happened, so we cannot eliminate such kind of possibility. So we should avoid such kind of illusion, I think. However, this COVID-19 gave us good, how should I say, point for us to think it over. First one is that we need to rethink the right balance between efficiency and also resilience. So far we put too much emphasis on efficiency, but resilience is important. So we need to increase resilience. But the complete 100% resilient and zero efficiency, this cannot, we cannot survive under such kind of circumstances. So again, my point is striking right balance. This is number one. Number two, related on this, we have to be careful about that too much focusing on the reliance on single country. This is dangerous. So again, we need to think about the right balance and diversification, onshoring. This is number two. And number three, international cooperation is very important, I think, to avoiding, reducing possibility. For example, as I mentioned previously, international agreement to restrict export ban, even under emergency, this is very important. I understand that even under WTO, export ban is allowed. However, by limiting such kind of export ban, we can reduce the possibility of shortage of supply kind of thing. So international cooperation is very important. I want to emphasize this.
How do we prevent this, Assistant Secretary, from happening again?
So I'm glad we're ending this question. It's an important one. And how I'm looking at this is not just a pandemic, a cyber attack, which I think we all can concede it's not within. It's within the realm of possibilities, and other national emergencies. So again, we're taking our 700 plus list of products, looking at really essentially 4 elements. What do we reshore, right? And how do we reshore that? And we talked a lot about that. Where can we stockpile, right? Where can we, if there is another national emergency that's right around the corner, what do we need a stockpile today to make sure we can get through that period? The other question is, what does that period look like? Do we need a stockpile level that feeds military needs, feeds military and commercial needs, and for what period of time? That's the second element that we're looking at. The third element, as we talked about, is we really have to figure out this retooling thing. If we're not going to make it here, which companies can retool to produce what is the lead time? How quickly can we get them up and running? That's going to be part of our 700 product lists. Who can do what? Again, who's going to what can we get restored? What do we need stockpiled? What can we do to retool to get the stuff we need up and running? And then finally, and I'm very glad Shin mentioned this, where we're relying on allies in the short term, maybe in the medium term, and even ultimately if we decide to rely on allies in the long term, how do we make sure that we have agreements with these allies so that if we are dependent on them, if they are dependent on us, we don't put export bans on the things that we need, that our allies need, and certainly our allies don't put export bans on the things we need. During the first few months of the pandemic, we had a huge problem in our reliance on supply chains in Mexico and the determination of what an essential worker was. And we couldn't get those workers to the factories to supply our defense sector. So we need to have really good comprehensive discussions with our allies in addition to prohibiting export restrictions, to figuring out how are we going to be coordinated to figure out which industries are going to be up and running during an emergency so that when we're reliant on them, they're able to deliver and vice versa. Thank you.
Chance for closing thoughts. We've got a couple minutes left. Let me just put something on the table. I would believe, I don't think you can copy paste a factory in Wuhan, China, and move it to Guatemala City or Mexico, or move it from Wuhan and put it in Wisconsin. There's a whole series of rule of law issues, there's software issues, there are infrastructure issues, trade agreements, et cetera, et cetera. I do think one of the things that we're going to see is, I would argue, so I think we're going to have to think about at the industry level what it takes to, whether it's infrastructure, power, workforce development, rules of the game, et cetera. And I think that implies negotiations, that implies diplomacy, that implies foreign assistance. That's kind of one point I would leave us to think about. The second point I would leave us to think about is the issue of trade agreements. I would argue every trade agreement the United States has ever entered into has had a geopolitical or geoeconomic driver behind it. I think that as a result of this, I think we're going to look at both bilateral and potentially plurilateral agreements with new eyes as a result of this. And so, for example, the Free Trade of the Americas Agreement in 2005 died on the vine for a variety of reasons, but I would argue one of the reasons was that in 2005, we didn't have the same level of geoeconomic or geostrategic or geopolitical exigency to make sure that we had a deeper partnership with our friends and allies in the Western Hemisphere. I would argue that as a result of this, I think there may be renewed interest in something like a Free Trade of the Americas Agreement over time. Not next year, not in the next 2 years, but over the next perhaps 5 to 7 years. I would also argue we may want to revisit the trade, something that looks like and quacks like the Trans-Pacific Partnership. We may call it something else, but I think as a result of this, something that excludes China, that this will also get an additional look. I'd welcome any final comments on those points I just made. John, Shin, and then the Assistant Secretary. John, your thoughts.
So Dan, I think those are good points about the value of our trade agreements, which have always been, as you say, about boosting trade and investment and creating jobs, mutually shared prosperity. But they've always had that geopolitical component as well. You just run through the list of countries and that's clear. So we need more of them. And I do think there's a conundrum here, as the administration has proposed, for instance, this economic prosperity network where the State Department is trying to craft, that network of friends, allies, close partners of the United States that we want to have closer trade ties with, maybe see supply chains favor those countries. But what exactly is the nature of that network? What is the benefit of being a part of it? And it's hard to define. Maybe we should have free trade agreements with all of them. We know what that is in the business community. We know that that can be really valuable. We've seen at the U.S. Chamber that free trade agreements in the first 5 years after we enter into them, we have U.S. export growth that is 5 times higher than what we've seen to the rest of the world on average. There's a real benefit to it. But when we're talking about big critical regions like Southeast Asia or Latin America, as you say, Dan, how do we put meat on the bones of those initiatives? So we'd like to see something that moves closer to the free trade agreement model, because we know what that is. We know that it works. We know that it strengthens supply chains, and it's worth more exploration.
Shan?
Yes, as Dan and John mentioned, I also think free trade agreement is very important. And right now, it's timing of that presidential election, so it's not so easy. But in longer term, of course, we hope that the U.S. come back to the TPP. This is number one, free trade agreement. Number two, I think, national security is very important, but we also have to be very careful about that. We have to abide national security. Concept of national security includes actually the mercantilist motivation. So if, reshoring or many other measure is based on that U.S. domestic employment only, same response will happen. For example, European first or Vietnam first or Japan first kind of that response. This is exactly what John mentioned. So we have to be very selective on that national security concept. If we broaden this without limitation, that makes it very difficult for U.S. to get international support. And third thing is, as I mentioned repeatedly, international cooperation is very important.
Assistant Secretary, I'll give you the last word.
Thank you. I think I wanted to mention 3 things. As everybody said, we've been talking about a domestic industrial policy. We need to really focus on that. We need to figure out, when we can invoke the national security exception, we can do a lot that doesn't run afoul of our WTO commitments. So one, strong domestic industrial policy, which we're working on. Certainly, as we mentioned, number 2, international cooperation, whether that's bilateral, plurilateral, multilateral agreements. We got to do more. We got to do it thoughtfully. We can't do it like we did before. We've got to make sure that, as we talked about, our allies have robust investment screening mechanisms, robust trade remedy laws, and they are really committed to not restricting exports and working very closely with us, so where we are dependent, we can leverage that dependency in a mutually positive way. And finally, we haven't really talked about this much, but I just wanted to end by underscoring the importance of food security. We need to make sure that in a time of a national crisis, we are able to feed ourselves and our allies are able to feed themselves. Because what I'm terrified about is a nation that's dependent on another country for food. That gives our adversaries sort of the winning ticket there, and we want to make sure that everybody is self-reliant there. Thank you for facilitating this important discussion, and thank you for having me.
Thanks, everybody. This is great. We're so appreciative that you all would have joined us today, and thanks again. Let's do this again sometime soon. Thanks, everybody.